Life Between the Rails, an oral history of Union Pacific Railroad, is a project sponsored by the American Heritage Center in Laramie, Wyoming, which seeks to document the history of Union Pacific through the untold stories of UP workers. To remember the calloused hands and the grease-stained overalls, the folks who kept the iron horses running through the nights and across the plains. It's about the voices of those who knew every curve and bend of the tracks. Throughout our discussions, one theme kept popping up, like a worn railroad spike on a hot summer day. This was the profound impact of changing technology and operational practices on those who kept the trains moving. The roundtable discussion at the Laramie Railroad Depot, featuring Jim Ehernberger, Ron Bagby, Scott Steere, Steve Lee, and Doug Johnson, captured the essence of the evolving railroad industry. Moderated by AHC Archivist Leslie Waggener, the conversation touched on experiences that spanned a long timeline, from memories of historic roundhouses and the last days of the caboose, to computer-controlled locomotives and communication via satellite.
I'm old enough that steam was still prevalent when I was a kid. My dad was a machinist in the roundhouse over here, and I remember many occasions coming into the roundhouse with him. He'd come down to pick up a paycheck or do whatever in the roundhouse, and that was really impressive. I mean, it was like a 3-story red brick affair. Of course, there weren't any other stories in it. It was just that's how tall they were. And I remember going in there, and the place was magical, and it would have scared me except for I had my dad's hand, and at that point he was still God, you know. And so I go in there, and I don't know how many stalls the roundhouse had, maybe 7, I don't know. But there would be a locomotive in almost every stall, and there'd be a pit underneath each one, and as soon as you walk in there, you could just, the place was alive almost. You could smell the fresh coal, you could smell the coal smoke, you could smell the grease, and a lot of the locomotives would have some steam built up in it so they could test whatever it was they were working on. And if they had steam in it, it was like the damn things were alive. They're like, ooh, and then there's always something clicking and snapping or letting off steam, and it was magical. And then in the pits underneath, you'd see the guys with the treble lights, and they'd be banging on stuff and cussing and discussing. It was fascinating. It was just fascinating.
When I hired out, I was told 4 things. 1, report for work on time. 2, report for work sober. 3, live up to the rules and regulations. And 4, keep your hand out of the till, because the type jobs I had would have had collecting money. Today I would not qualify because of the computer age, and they require education, something that I didn't have. I hired out at age 16 and continued to work for 34 years, actually closer to 35. I left in 1988, and by then they wanted college graduates.
I worked in the signal department. There's 2 parts of the signal department. There's maintenance and construction, and both of them operate without telling the other one what's going on. But they were both parts of the signal department. And I worked in the maintenance and for quite a few years, and in the construction end. I hired on in the construction end, and when we hired on, we were assistant signalmen, and our tools were a pick and shovel and a set of climbing gear. That's the tools used every day. And we lived, you know, this bunk car out here, that's what we lived in when we hired on. And on the sidings, it put us where we'd meet at work on the sidings and sleep in the bunk cars.
When Steve was a manager here, that the engineer was actually running the train. I mean, and that lasted until about 2018. I retired in 2019. I could see the writing on the wall. I was old enough to go, but I could see they were taking the fun out of my job. I enjoyed running trains, and I enjoyed running trains fast. You couldn't, I mean, I would take them, I wouldn't violate the rules by speeding, but if I could run that train 70 miles an hour, I pegged her at 70. I enjoyed it. I took pride in my work. I have 3 people on a switch crew, 3 guys on the ground and an engineer running the engine. And a very good switch crew was a well-oiled machine. There was some, if they were good at it, they were always in the right position, and it flowed like a Swiss clock. It really did. You could handle a lot of cars and do it safely. And now there's only one person on the ground, and they don't move near as many cars in an 8-hour shift. They just can't.
An excellent engineer has a good ass.
Yeah.
You know, if you're sitting there and you stand up, you've suddenly lost the feel of your train.
You have, absolutely.
Steam engine days, they didn't even have speedometers on the engines. You want to know how fast you're going? Use your watch and a milepost. And that's how you figure out how fast you were going. And these guys, they learned to run in the fog, they learned to run in the snow, and they knew, I mean, you could wake one of them up in the middle of the night and he'd know exactly where he was, probably within a half a mile. They were that good. We had air brakes, and that was it. And you had to learn to control the train going up and downhill, all that sort of thing. We used to say, you can give the conductor a good ride, and you've done a good job. So, and the old guys, when they started out, a 35-car train was a big train. Nowadays, it's 250 or 300 cars, something like that. Totally different. And you don't have somebody riding on the rear end that you have to worry about. But yeah, I can remember the conductor would get on the radio and say, "Hey, you knocked me on my butt back here. Well, just lay there for a while and I'll stand you back up in a few minutes." All of these locomotives now have GPS on them, and they have two-way computer communications with the headquarters. And if you want to see what a train's doing, you sit down and type in this, that, and the other, and you can see exactly where he is, how fast he's going, what throttle notch he's in, all this sort of thing.
AI continues to become a dominating force in American industry. How much do you think it's going to affect the operation of these trains when they're going to implement AI? And they probably already are in these computer programs that are now running these trains. It's coming, and I don't believe there's any stopping it.
Another roundtable discussion conducted by the project gathered 5 former railroaders together at the Cheyenne Depot Museum. Robert Fryml, Howard Meeker, Dick Merklin, Rick DeHerrera, and John Schmechel. AHC Archivist John Waggener moderated a discussion in which many aspects of technology were explored. Challenging transitions were remembered, as well as tales of hard-won experience and the ways in which the railroad transformed within the space of a generation.
In my opinion, one of the big things that happened with technology was putting in quarter-mile rail. That reduced a lot of the maintenance away, and they built that rail plant over in Laramie, and we ran rail trains both directions out of Laramie, and that was when the Union Pacific was going from jointed rail to quarter-mile rail, and it changed. There used to be sections all the way across Wyoming. It was instrumental in getting rid of them, because then all of a sudden the track didn't need as much maintenance. In my career as an engineer, we saw, in my opinion, the first generation of locomotives, diesel electric locomotives, come through here, and then in the course of my career, we always got the new locomotives, not on every train. But when new locomotives got bought by the Union Pacific Railroad, they came through here, and if sometimes you'd get on a brand new locomotive. That was a lot of fun. Changing from a 2,000 horsepower to 2,500 horsepower to 3,000 horsepower to 3,500 horsepower to 4,000 horsepower is a big change in locomotives. And our union guys were very instrumental in making sure that the cabs were, the seats and the cabs were crash worthiness and different things like that. The computerization of the railroad. We saw it in its infancy, and we saw it to, well, the way it is now. where the locomotives are run by computers now. We just saw a lot of change of the railroad coming into the 21st century and being pretty modern. Getting rid of the cabooses was a thing that was going to happen. It changed how we ran trains as engineers and how the railroad wanted trains run. And it was quite an art to run a train with two guys on the rear end and not hurt them running across Wyoming at 70 miles an hour. And when they got rid of the caboose, the conductor came up to the head end with us and made sure we rode the straight and narrow.
One of the things they did with the computers, and as somebody were here mentioning, they increased the horsepower of these locomotives. The AC engines that came out, 4,000 plus horsepower, they had those wheels computerized such that if a wheel was going to slip, the computer could unload the power on that wheel so that it wouldn't slip. And I know that somewhere along the line, there's a lot of knuckles that I didn't have to change because the train didn't jerk. So, you know, I appreciate the computer being able to do that. Made for a rough ride on the engine, but, you know, I got off in one piece. So big changes would have to include the implementation of safety procedures, the enforcement of rule violations. When I hired out, every locomotive had a footboard on the front of it. When we were switching, we would stand on those footboards. All of a sudden, that's verboten. We don't do that anymore. And it went all the way to the point where we were no longer allowed to detrain or board moving equipment. The train had to be stopped. Stopped a lot of progress around here, not getting work done, but that didn't really seem to worry the railroad. They were adamant that we were all going to comply with all of the safety rules. Right now, at age 79, when I move around, I'm looking for things to hang on to, things that I learned on the railroad. It said that all rules are written in blood.
Well, that was when our rule book was this thick and about like that.
Yeah.
Now you got 4 or 5 volumes.
In 1992, when we lost the brakemen, both brakemen, and the reserve boards came on, that was all right. I mean, you know, stay home and get paid. But then, you know, the next thing was when I became an engineer, and this was just within the last couple of years before I retired. They put these fuel management systems, and one is Leader, and what's the name of the other one? Trip Optimizer? And I hated those. I hated those things. And, you know, I would engage them just because we had to. But if they didn't run the train 70 miles an hour, I'd call the dispatcher and tell them, and they'd give us a ticket number, which then I could stop the train, disengage it, and run the train. That's what they hired me to do. And I was kind of rebellious because I did not want that technology to get a foothold, but of course it did. And then in about a year before I retired, they put positive train control in, and so that had to stay on. And so, but you know, they wanted you to use both of them. And I wouldn't do the fuel managements, but I did have to let the PTC run the train. And so, but those were the things that I did not like, because, you know, it made us, like he said, you know, we weren't able to run the train the way that we were hired to do it. And I didn't like that.
I was with UP for 33 years, in the railroad industry for 38 years altogether. And so I saw a lot of different railroad cultures. My initial impression with Union Pacific even though I have a great deal of respect for John Kennefick and Bob Richmond, Vice President of Operations, and Jerry Davis, his successor. I have tremendous respect for those guys. But Union Pacific wasn't a business. It was a country club run by a comical cadre of alcohol-fueled psychotics. That stopped on December 22nd, 1982, when we were merged with the no-nonsense. Well, we didn't actually merge with them. UP Corporation and the Missouri Pacific Corporation merged. They came over here and they started running UP like a business. And it was a harsh transition.
Go back to my two engineers that were old head engineers from the steam engine days. And I was fortunate to have two of the best ones on the 3rd District for my mentoring. And Ernie Johnson and Junie Faulkner. They taught me how to wheel brake. Those of you who are engineers know what wheel braking is. It's where a locomotive that has dynamic braking on it, if the dynamic brakes are not powerful enough to slow your train down, they taught me how to wheel brake by putting less than 20 pounds of brakes in the engine's brakes. That would continue your dynamic braking forces, but it also give you 20 pounds of engine brake.
The railroad's a harsh mistress. And like somebody pointed out to me early in my career, the railroad runs like the river flows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when she calls, you better be there. One of the most delightful aspects of my railroad career were the people I worked with, particularly in trade and engine service. And the way I put it is this way. In a world full of skim milk personalities, the average railroad man is a chocolate molded, thick and rich. In fact, there were not only a lot of chocolate moldeds I worked with, there were more than a few hot fudge sundaes and even a small number of banana splits. That's what kind of thick personalities these guys were.
I hired out as an engineer were called road foreman of engines, and they had actually run this track, and they knew it. And so when you'd ride with them in training, and if you did something wrong, they weren't afraid to say, you better do it right, or we're not going to let you run trains for the Union Pacific Railroad. And so you learn to do it correctly. And well, at that time, that was the correct way to do it. As the railroad changed and the economy changed, and they didn't need you to be there, speed didn't matter anymore. It was like they were trying to figure out the maximum speed they needed to go. They came across a particular speed, and now they're coming back and they're saying, well, now the way the economy runs now, we don't need to run trains that fast. And you can talk to these guys at work now. It's just the phrase when I was retiring was, everybody puts their float in the parade in single file, here we go. And that wasn't the way it used to be. If you had a hot train years ago, they cleared the railroad for you and lickety-split, you went. And it was a lot of fun back then, running trains for the Union Pacific Railroad. A lot of fun. A lot of us guys grew old together doing it.
These are the voices of workers who lived through derailments and pay cuts, through strikes and long, lonely stretches of track. And now their stories will be preserved to remind us all that the real power of the Union Pacific wasn't in the steel, but in the hands and hearts that kept it moving. This project is a way to tip our hat, to say, we remember, we're still listening.